Season 3 of The Fairer Sense is sponsored by FreshBooks, the cloud accounting software for freelancers that's the easiest possible way to send invoices and stay on top of your accounting. Stay tuned for info on how you can get a free 30-day trial while supporting the podcast.
Welcome to The Fairer Sense.
With me, Tanja.
And me, Kara.
Women, money, and the fight to break even.
Because we give a shit. And you should too. Today, Being an Ally Part 1, How Men Can Advocate for Women. Hey, Tanja.
Hey, Kara.
Welcome back. Welcome back to the studio.
Also known as my desk and your... Are you in your office or are you in the bathroom today?
Today, I have the luxury of being at my own desk.
I just always love the image. I know that there were a couple of episodes where, to get the best sound, you had a pillow fort set up on top of your toilet and you were talking in there. And I don't think our listeners appreciate enough what you went through to make those episodes happen.
That was a time. Let me tell you. I literally had to build a pillow fort on top of the toilet and then stick my face into it. I mean, it was so weird. It was so strange. But those days are behind me now, hopefully.
Yeah. Yeah. Now you're at a desk in a chair, right? Civilized grown up.
I mean, I've made it. This is it. Doesn't get better than this.
You've arrived. You had always arrived in my heart, but I'm glad that now you're not crouching over a toilet to record a podcast.
And before that, I was in the closet. I mean, I have just recorded all over the place, over this town.
It seems like there are some strange metaphors in all of this, but maybe we should move on.
Yeah, let's just drive right on past that and
let's get into it. So today is the first part in a 2-part series that's really focused on how we can all be better allies for one another, because we certainly know this is a world in which things are not perfect and we all do better if we are in this together. And so today we're talking about how men can be better allies to women, specifically economically. And the next episode, actually next week, is going to be a special one, which we'll talk about in a sec. But the one after that is going to be the continuation of this part about how white women especially can be allies to women of color.
I'm really, really jazzed about this 2-parter because it's such a nuanced discussion. And everyone kind of brings their own history and goals and view to the allyship, but we wanted to have a conversation around it so that we can kind of define it for our podcast, define it for ourselves, and share how we have both learned and grown and how we act as allies in our lives today.
I would almost say how you, Kara, have been. I am still very much learning and on the journey, but today we're talking with guys, and I really appreciated that we had 3 men talk to us and share some very vulnerable stuff about their own journeys of learning to be better allies to women, better advocates for women, and what that's been like. And I think that's not always easy to talk about. So I really appreciate the honesty that everyone brought to the discussions.
A point that all 3 of them made is, in fact, that it's not easy to talk about, especially in certain circles of their lives. So I love every single one of our guests. I really do. I loved the conversation that I got to have. I loved listening to the conversation you got to have. And I think when we talk about men acting as allies to women, especially when it comes to money, it's a tricky area. Talking about money anyway, tricky. But especially for men, for a woman to bring up to a man hey, there's a wage gap. What are we doing about it? And for men to bring up to other men how those men talk about women in general and how they talk about women in the workplace and being a financial ally, very much so uncharted territory for a lot of dudes. So I was so grateful for everyone for coming on the show and for participating with us.
We're going to share 2 different segments today. One of them is very much about advocating kind of in real life, and the other is more about advocating online. But I think most of us now can appreciate that online is real life. The internet is the real world. And especially for women, where our experience, especially on social media, is very much colored these days by being attacked, sometimes being threatened or worse. That's real life. And we need men to be allies in both spaces, both the real world at work and online.
But before we get into that, one quick note. So one half of this podcast has a very, very exciting day coming up next week, and we are going to have an episode about it. Tanja is publishing her first, but not her last book. And so our episode next week is going to be devoted to achieving creative dreams. So I am going to interview Tanja about this amazing achievement that she has reached.
I'm super excited about it. Obviously.
It's going to be great.
Yeah, we're less than a week to publication at this point, and it's all still very surreal. The book is called Work Optional, Retire Early, the Non-Penny Pinching Way, available wherever books are sold, and narrated by yours truly. And I'm excited to talk about that next week.
Yeah, so if you can't get enough of this sexy, sexy voice of Tanja Hester's, make sure you get that ebook, and make sure you pre-order. Stop what you're doing right now, which is listening to us. Log on, pre-order that. Get it sent to your house, start reading it, leave a fabulous review. Thank you very much. I am officially Tanja's PR lady. This is what y'all need to do. Our first guest is Cord Jefferson, who is a writer for all your favorite TV shows, The Good Place, Watchmen, Master of None. And he is somebody that I have followed for a long time. I have followed him on Tumblr for years. Y'all know I love my Tumblr community. He is also someone that I have heard on Call Your Girlfriend, which is one of my favorite podcasts. He's friends with Amina and Anne. So he has gotten my attention over the years by being really open and honest about his relationship with women and being a vocal feminist. So I definitely wanted to have him on the show.
We are in an iteration of America in which these kinds of opinions and feelings are being institutionalized. The president of the United States has made it sort of very common for him to denigrate and degrade women constantly. He famously now has said that he has assaulted women and bragged about it on a bus and on a talk show. We have two men in the Supreme Court now who have both been accused of abuse in various forms. Sort of unfortunately, once we start institutionalizing people like that behavior starts to leach into the rest of society. And those are the people who are setting the tone for America. It's no surprise to me that Americans are behaving this way. As women are becoming more empowered and becoming more independent and sort of like finding their voices in America, I think that a lot of men are terrified by that. There was a great interview that Toni Morrison did on Charlie Rose that I think about from time to time, in which she talked about whiteness and racism, and what she said about that was sort of, I'm paraphrasing here, but it's essentially asking white people and racists, like, what are you without racism? If you are not better than a black person, if you sort of, if that's a neuroses, racism is a neuroses, and if you aren't comfortable in your own skin, if you're not better than a black person or Latino or an Asian, you're sort of left with yourself, and you're left to sort of really navigate how good you are and how smart you actually are. I think that the sort of money quote in the interview is, if you can only be tall because someone else is on their knees, then you have a serious problem. And I think that that can be easily applied to gender also. And I think that as more women become empowered and independent, and they sort of are finding their own spaces, and they're sort of separating themselves from men, that a lot of men are realizing that they're not comfortable with themselves unless they have somebody to be better than in society. And so if you're not better than a woman, then what are you actually? My male friends and I certainly talk about this more than we used to in the past, but I still worry that we don't talk about it enough amongst ourselves. It's certainly a conversation I have with a lot of my female friends, but I probably would be lying if I said it's a conversation I have a lot with my male friends.
So I have a boyfriend. We do a lot of things together. When we're in mixed company, he's very vocal about, he identifies as a feminist and will go to bat for women. But he still struggles when he's in male-only environments to kind of bring up the feminist perspective, or to say like, hey man, that's not cool. And it's something that he's kind of been trying to challenge in himself. But I think it's something a lot of men struggle because it's not necessarily, you can't speak to lived experience, right?
No, I think that's absolutely right. And I also think that, men have been just as damaged by, maybe that's not true, not just as, but I think that men have been damaged by sort of like a patriarchal society in that it is a neuroses. It's you're slightly crazy because you've sort of like been brought up to believe that your masculinity and your sort of like identity as a man is deeply important, and that men I think are just as afraid to step out of that society and that societal norm as women sometimes, if that makes sense.
So I'm curious, what do you think as a dude? What can we as ladies, as the host of this podcast, say to men to kind of explain why we need these spaces for ourselves? What would you say to dudes to be like, hey, here's why these ladies are doing that thing?
What I would say to men is that I believe that I'm quoting Shonda Rhimes when I say this, but I am also definitely quoting my good friend Amina, who I have absolutely heard say this before, which is that no is a complete sentence. So if you want your own space as a woman, then you need only say like, no, men aren't allowed here. And this is our thing. And what men need to start doing is being comfortable living with that and sort of understanding that is your truth and that is sort of how you want to live your life. And this is a thing that you want to do. And this is a thing that's important to you. And men need to start accepting that and say, okay, and live with it. The problem is that there is a sense of entitlement in a great many men. I think there's particularly a sense of entitlement in white men who've, for centuries in this country and in the world really have sort of been given free reign over most of society. There were very few places in the past that a white man couldn't go. And so I think nowadays when women and people of color and other minorities are sort of building spaces and environments for themselves to flourish and to sort of talk amongst themselves and figure out their problems, that white men and also men in general feel neglected and feel left out.
You mentioned Amina. We love Call Your Girlfriend on the show. And you were on their show a while back. You were answering questions from some of the listeners. But you specifically spoke about this thing that some men do where they ask women, like, how are you feeling? As sort of a way to pat themselves on the back. And they're like, I'm the good guy. I inquired. I did the bare minimum, right? Or like, I was a decent person. And I think there's a lot of men out there who are like, well, I'm not using the word bitch. I'm not using the word cunt. Like, I'm a total ally, but they kind of still suck. As a guy who can see that happening and who recognizes toxic masculinity in play, how do you think men can support women without being that guy?
I think a problem with a lot of men nowadays is that at least this sort of specific flavor of man that we're talking about right now is that a lot of that is performative. It feels like performative feminism. It feels like I'm doing this because I want to be seen as a feminist. It's important for me because they sort of understand that it's cool to be a feminist and that women like you more if you're a feminist. And so what I'm doing is I'm going to be a performative feminist and I'm going to sort of pat women on the back and say, how are you doing? And I'm a good guy and I'm not saying bitch. And so I'm doing sort of my part. But I think that what is deeply important is what happens behind the scenes when you are in these sort of male only spaces and when you're hanging out with your guy friends and when you're hanging out in your basketball team or your frat, and sort of what are the conversations that are going on in those spaces when women aren't around, when there aren't women in earshot who are sort of like checking in on you. And I think that to your point earlier, that your boyfriend has a sort of a harder time speaking up when he's in the company of only men as opposed to mixed company. I think that a lot of men have that problem. And so I think that I certainly have that problem. And so I think that what's really, really important is to start having these conversations behind the scenes, so to speak, sort of when you're in male only spaces and when you're hearing people make rape jokes or degrade or demean women or say that, that they don't plan on hiring women for a particular job or that they don't want women to work with them. It's important for men to then stand up and say something then. I think that there's still so many places in society in which women aren't allowed, in which men hold the vast majority, if not all, of the power. And so it's important in those spaces for men who are actually allies to take an initiative to speak up and to speak on behalf of women and speak in support of women.
Do you talk about money with your friends?
Very rarely, to be quite honest. I think that, it's like religion. It's not sort of you're raised to see it as impolite to discuss money.
You've worked in a bunch of different mediums and different types of writing. And so I'm sure you have different pay scales for your journalism work, for your television work, and different probably like ways you get paid. Do you ever talk about maybe not so much exactly how much you're making, but like how you're invoicing or how you set yourself up as a journalist? Like, oh, I'm a sole proprietor over here, but I'm under contract over here or something like that.
To be quite honest, I don't. The vast majority of my income now comes in from television work, and something that I will say very proudly is that we are unionized as TV writers, and so the union deals with a lot of sort of our scale rates, and sets amounts for how much money we are going to earn. I think that is one of the benefits of unionizing, is that sort of it makes it easier for people who are traditionally left out of the money in these worlds feel included, because it sort of like fights for everybody. That being said, of course, we have our agents and our managers and our other representatives who negotiate fees for us. So we have the scale, of course, but then if you have a great agent, they're going to negotiate more money for you. So that is something that I certainly probably should be talking to my coworkers about. It's something that I don't talk to my coworkers about. I will say that one of the things that the scale does is sort of, that if somebody is like a co-executive producer, or if there's a woman on a show that I'm working on who's a supervising producer, I know guaranteed she's making more money than me just because it's a union show. And so just by virtue of her being higher up on the totem pole than me, then she's guaranteed to make more money than me.
I'm not sure if you think about this, but I would imagine that as a person of color, sometimes you're like, well, am I being discriminated against as a Black man? I mean, like, she's being discriminated against as a lady, but like, it's the intersectionality, right? There's a lot of stuff that goes into it, and you're not in a place that my white boyfriend is in to be able to like T-Bone should be shouting his pay from the rooftops for everyone to hear. And you and I are like, okay, we're on the second and third floors with our megaphones, but
how would you suggest I bring this up? If I real world scenario, if I were sort of like sitting down with some of my women coworkers, what do you think is the appropriate way to talk about this?
What I hear the most from other women, and especially my coaching clients, is it's just they're nervous to make the ask and they don't have something to latch onto. So if they hear he asked for 20, he asked for parking space or something, well, I can ask for those things. I know someone else has done it. Running a business of one means you wear many hats: marketer, content creator, CEO, office custodian. There are many things that demand your attention, and you need all the assistance you can get.
That's why cloud accounting software FreshBooks is so cool. They take the work out of getting paid so you can focus on doing the work you need to keep your business running. With FreshBooks, you can create a customized invoice, track all your income, and link a business credit card to automatically track business spending.
FreshBooks makes it super simple to do your accounting. The website is clean and easy to understand, and it makes accounting one less thing that you need to worry about as a business owner.
Most accounting services come with lots of bells and whistles that you don't need as a freelancer, and FreshBooks cuts all of that out to make it as easy to use as possible. We've both used it and can attest to it being the easiest possible way to do your accounting, and maybe the prettiest.
Plus, FreshBooks has recently gotten into the events game, which I love, with their hashtag #IMakeALiving events around the US. They talk to freelancers and small business owners about how they make a living, which is something that we both think is pretty cool.
Head to freshbooks.com/TFC to claim your 30-day free trial and enter the Fairer Cents in the How Did You Hear About Us section. It's a win-win. You get something free while supporting the Fairer Cents. Join the 24 million people who've used FreshBooks already. That's freshbooks.com/TFC. For our second interview today, I spoke with Matt Lane, who writes the blog Optimize Your Life, which is optimizeyourlife.co, and Brian, who writes the blog Done by 40. And they are both some of our favorite people on Twitter who are really incredible online allies for women. And I wanted to talk with them about how they became allies and also what it's meant for them in real life.
I used to be that person that would sort of quietly watch the debates happen. I think the tipping point for me, honestly, was there was a debate over one of the doctors in the personal finance community came out and said basically that he refuses to be alone in a room with a woman because he's afraid of being sued because of some made up claims. And there was a big debate about whether, that was justified or not. And I was reading the debate because I find that sort of thing really interesting. It really was just women on one side and men on the other side. And it just felt wrong to me. It looked wrong. And I decided at that point that I should say something just to change the optics of that. It seemed like it really connected with people and was sort of actually meaningful, where I felt like I guess I was afraid of more being guilty of sort of the downsides, the negative connotations of virtue signaling, where like, am I just doing this to make myself feel better? People told me afterwards and, months later, I really appreciated you stepping in on that. And I feel like hearing that and hearing that people found it meaningful sort of pushed me to do more of that.
I get upset whenever I see usually guys in the personal finance community, specifically within the FIRE community, say stuff that I feel like is almost like kind of parody level bad. That's usually my first reaction. I was like, are you serious right now? There is a podcaster. I think that was kind of the flip moment for me. There was a specific podcaster who would just jump into threads and just, I really thought he was joking at first. I was like, that can't be right. But no, it's just what he thought. That's usually the point where I'll jump into it. I'm like, if you're just saying something that's like so over the line and it's making me like viscerally angry, then that is usually where I'll jump in.
I'd love to know from you guys, have you paid a price for that? Like, have you guys lost followers, or have you had to put up with more crap from people pushing back against you?
On the followers count, I'd say I've certainly lost some followers, but I've also gained a lot more. I think I'm net positive on followers after being more outspoken. Actually, very net positive. On the taking more crap, I definitely take a lot more crap and get into a lot more, I guess, Twitter beefs on my own page that I do not just jump into, that people come at me for, which I guess makes sense, but I didn't really prepare for. But yeah, definitely a lot more contention, a lot more people coming at me. But I think on the whole, it's been net positive for building an audience.
I think for me, the place I've seen it suffer is some relationships within the personal finance community. People who, when I first started writing 6 years ago, we would comment on each other's blogs or like be like friends on Twitter, I guess. But now in some cases, I have chosen to block them or vice versa, because I guess, I don't know. I actually don't feel bad about it. But if there was a cost, I would say that that's probably it, that there's certain relationships that could be quite beneficial for blogging that are now like basically non-existent.
I know a lot of us feel really grateful that you guys jump into some of the discussions, because like Matt, you were talking about the blowback that you get. Like it's sort of like, welcome to our world. Like, how dare you have an opinion online as a woman? And it's interesting too to think about some of the ways that that's really visible. Like, I've tweeted multiple times asking people not to equate debt and slavery, because words mean something. I think we can do better. We shouldn't be acting like slavery was the same as debt that you can declare bankruptcy from. And I've gotten very little response on that. But then like recently, Matt, you tweeted that, which thank you for doing that. I think the more of us spouting that message, the better. But like, you got real engagement on it. And it was very interesting to observe that difference. And maybe some was just like Twitter algorithm, like my tweets on it didn't kind of pop on people's feed. But it was very interesting to see, like, when a woman says it, it doesn't mean anything. When a man says it, maybe it means a little more. So we need you guys in there.
Yeah, I hadn't really thought about the sort of gender aspect on that issue. I've certainly been in Twitter debates and real life debates, I guess, where I'm basically saying something that women have said before, but it connects more coming from someone that, looks like them. It's weird, and I feel very strange about it. Like, I feel like it's something that's useful because the message is getting through, but also it feels like I'm just kind of co-opting a message that's not mine. So it is a weird feeling, even though I think it's a net positive.
I think if you were in there saying like, oh, here, I had this revelation and like I had this big idea, that would be one thing. But you're not doing that. You're just telling people to do a common sense thing that they aren't hearing when others say it. It's annoying that people can't hear it when I say it, but I just want them to hear it in that case, you know?
Yeah, and I think amplifying voices of others that have, for whatever reason, less of a platform, less of an in with the people that need to hear the message is a useful thing that we can do.
I think that's something that in the FIRE community or personal finance writer community, that's something that we ought to be doing more of, is reading more diverse groups of writers and sharing those writers' work more. And again, very low bar, but something that is achievable like tomorrow.
If someone was to come back and say, okay, cool, I'm committed to doing that, but I have looked and looked and I can't find these more diverse writers. If you look at curated lists that are out there, curated lists are very skewed toward white guys, especially in the personal finance space, but I think pretty much every aspect of society. You say, well, I searched every list that exists. Are we actually expecting people to create their own list? Like, are we expecting every single person to do that? If someone says, okay, how do I read more diverse writers? How do they start? How do you do that?
Blogging has this neat part of networking within it. If you go to the comment section of writers that you like, you will find new ones typically. So that's kind of how I started, at least. It is probably the least efficient way, but if I start from the assumption that everyone reads some people of color, some women writers, and other within those groups' comment sections, there are other ones. And of course, there are other resources. Tread Lightly, Retire Early wrote a really good list of women writers. Within my own group of people I follow, I have kind of built outwards from just the people that I really liked. And then I found out if I looked even just a little bit, there are other people who read and comment on her blog who are also amazing. And then it kind of grows from there.
I think we're also at a point where this is on people's minds more. Finding sort of more diverse sources of inspiration and finding other people to read, other people to listen to. So there are lists out there if you're willing to Google and search. There's pretty much lists of everything I could imagine. I know there's the female writers list that you had. I know there's an African-American writers list. There's an Asian writers list just off the top of my head. And I'm sure there are all sorts of others. You know, if you're willing to go into Google and actively try to find diverse writers, try to find diverse podcasters, you can do that because there are a lot of people out there making those lists, making it easier for us to do that. I don't know how true that was a few years ago, but I have definitely seen that recently.
It's clear that you guys both made a similar transition of kind of sitting back to being more engaged in those discussions. I'm curious if doing that has changed how you see anything at work or in the offline world. Like, has it made you feel more empowered to be an ally in all of life, or were you both already just amazing allies?
For myself, I can say it has made me feel more pressure to speak out more in the real world and at work and in sort of physical situations. Especially at work, it's made me feel like I need to live up to my Twitter presence almost. I feel like it's much harder in person when you're sitting and facing someone to say, hey, that's not an okay thing to say. Or, hey, this is why you might want to think about that and use different phrasing in the future. Or here's how you want to approach someone differently. I feel like it's a lot harder. But after having, I guess, a reputation for being outspoken online, it does feel like I've pressured myself to do more in person because it is really hard and it's something that I have not always been good at. And I've been trying to be better, especially over the last few years.
That is not what I expected you to say. That's interesting.
Yeah, I would agree that in person is the hardest version of it. I almost find it easier at work because there are more established rules of etiquette that I think can overlap with what we're talking about here. But with friends in person, I feel like that, for me at least, is the hardest one to clear. Though I'm finding it easier now, I do think that it's easier with your friends to kind of model what you think is good behavior and to, gently check your friend because you know that, it's not going to end the relationship if you have an honest conversation with him. But yeah, I am finding it easier, though. There is something that is, I don't want to say it's dread, but it is uncomfortable to have that honest conversation with one of your friends. At least I still do. I find it very uncomfortable.
I love a good side hustle. They're how I paid off my student loans, and they'll always have a place in my heart. One of the cutest side hustles is dog walking, or dog sitting, or dog cuddling, or anything to do with dogs, really. Rover is the largest network of 5-star pet sitters and dog walkers in North America, and it's a great side hustle. If you want to make cash to pay off your debt or to pad your savings, visit rover.com/cents and click Become a Sitter. Enter the fairer cents in the How Did You Hear About Us box so they know you're a listener. Sitters with Rover set their own rates, hours, and the services they offer. Not into dog walking? That's cool. You can get into some doggy daycare action. Rover side hustlers use the app to get paid, communicate with pet owners, and are covered by the Rover Guarantee, which provides coverage in case some scenarios go a little sideways. Visit rover.com/cents and click Become a Sitter, then enter your name, zip code, email, and password, and click Get Started if you're ready for an adorable side hustle. That's rover.com/CENTS.
I think my very favorite part of your conversation with Cord was you're interviewing him, you're asking the questions, but he stopped and said, hey, how can I be better? How can I advocate for women? I thought that was just a really nice moment, and also that on a recorded medium, he would do that, especially because he's clearly aware, as he talked about, the kind of performative aspect of being a good ally, which I want to talk about more in a minute. Like, I actually don't think that's all bad, but I appreciated that he seems sincerely interested in listening.
I also loved that he asked that. And it really made me think about how few men ask that question because so many men think they know already how best to be an ally, or how many men think they know what women need or the best way to manage situations and people. And so I think a huge act of allyship is to say, what specifically can I do for you? What do you need? And then to shut up and listen to what they have to say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, something that I personally struggle with a lot, both for myself and thinking about others, is this question of asking and what each person's role is. Because at the same time that I appreciate his question very much and that he seems sincere in wanting to listen, I think a lot of women can also relate to the feeling of like, whoa, bro, like it's not my job to educate you. It's your job to educate yourself. It's not women's job to educate men. It's not people of color's job to educate white people. It's not disabled people's job to educate able-bodied people. Like whatever the oppressed person is, it's not their job to expend emotional labor to make other people understand. That should be on each of us to be better people. But I also appreciate the question. And like, I don't know, we're going to, I know, talk about the same question again in the episode 2 from now, when we talk about how white women can be better allies to women of color. But it's, to me, a very central and a really tricky one to think about, because we want people asking questions. We want people being curious. We want them listening, but we also don't want to put all that burden on women or people of color to do all the educating.
It's very true. It is a fine line to walk, because it is difficult to asking feels like extracting from someone who is already marginalized. But I do think clarity around how best to be an ally is very, very helpful, because so often there are people who are well-intentioned whose execution sucks. And I think about episode 4 on emotional labor, where Gemma Hartley talks about in her article on emotional labor, her husband says to her, why didn't you tell me to do that? I would have done it. And she's like, bro, I don't want to have to ask you. You should just know it needs to get done. And I can totally see, as a woman, I sometimes feel like, how can you not see the patriarchy and the bullshit and the sexism that we're dealing with? You should know better. You should know how to treat women better. Just do it. And I can see how people of color would think, you can see the racism, do better than that. I saw a tweet that was like, literally the bar is don't whip your dick out in public and be a Nazi. And people are pushing back against that. I was like, true. We can do so much better. And so as allies, it really is your job. The onus is on you to self-educate and to stay a part of the conversation without taking space or extracting too much work from the people who are marginalized.
I do think that that's something, like, I personally struggle with the right balance on that. I think any man who is struggling with that of like, when do I ask versus when should I just shut up and go look stuff up for myself? I mean, I think that that's a natural struggle. And I think if you feel that struggle, that means you're heading in the right direction. That means that you are going down the right road. So that's a really good thing. So I just say that to kind of give permission, like, that's good. If you're struggling with that question, that's a good thing. But the piece that's really tough for me is like, okay, so let's say you're a man and you have recently become aware of just how big and horrible the patriarchy can be for both men and women. And you've come to understand a lot of the stuff that women put up with every day that you didn't used to see, but now you see it. And you're saying like, okay, how can I do better? I mean, to me, like, I think that there are kind of two problems. One is the question of whose job is it to educate you? And I think on that, I do really think it's up to each of us to do that homework ourselves. But I also recognize we're in a world where the information is imperfect. Like we've talked about this before here with, if you look at a lot of lists, for example, of like best blogs or best books of last year or any kind of list, it's going to tend to be overpopulated with things written by white men and underpopulated with things written by women and people of color. It's the same with like the Oscars, Oscars so white. Like this is just sort of the world we live in where white male is the default. And so actually then finding content or finding education by people who have been more marginalized isn't always easy. And I think that we have to recognize that and try to at least point people in the right direction. So I think that directional questions of like someone asking, where's a good place to start? That feels hopefully better than just saying like, what do I need to know? Educate me, which is not that person's job. At the same time though, the place where it really is appropriate is sort of the kind of question that Cord asked you, which is like, how can I specifically help you specifically? So it's not like educate me about the big world of oppression, but it's like, I want to help you. What do you need that I could do? And that person may not have a great answer. And it may still be on you to go out and find the answer. But that question to me feels better than like, explain sexism to me.
I think where you are going to learn matters a lot. So if you enter a space where the discussion is already happening, you can feel free to join that discussion. So for example, if you come to my website where I am actively writing about the intersection of finances and feminism, you can ask a question about being a feminist or whatever there. That's appropriate. If you come to my house while I'm trying to relax and, demand that I educate you, that's not appropriate. Like, don't do that. So I think, context matters. Use your brain. Think about it. Another big part of allyship is doing it when the person you're trying to be an ally to is not around. So if you walk into a boardroom and there are no women there, you still need to advocate for women, whether that's looking around and saying, hey, isn't it weird that there's no women here? Or it's in the language of the policy and making sure that that is not just going to apply to the people who are represented in that room. It's not just being an ally when it's convenient or when you're already in those spaces. It's doing it all the time, especially when there's no woman to advocate for herself or there's no person of color to advocate for themselves.
A big assumption that people make, we talked about this last season with the Beyonce found 20 Black violinists to play with her at Coachella. So you have no excuse for not being able to find people who can represent different groups. I do think that the default is to assume that if a panel comes up at a conference and it's all white men, that there just weren't any women or there weren't any people of color who were able to speak to it. And you assume that the organizers or whoever did the inviting did that work. And I think that another big part of being an ally is not assuming that, is asking if you get invited to participate in something, okay, who else is in it? And if it's an all white male list or an all white anyone list, that you say, hey, no, like this is not how it needs to be. We need more representation. We need to try looking a little harder. But that to me is an important piece as well. And sometimes that is going to be performative. Like you see people tweet things sometimes that say like, oh, I was invited to be on this panel, but I said no because it was all white dudes or whatever. That to me is a performative aspect that I think is okay and that I think is good because it shows women that people are allies for us, shows people of color the same thing. And it puts pressure on other men to act similarly. And that to me is like the performative part that I appreciate. Like Brian and Matt jumping in on Twitter and saying like, hey, sexist dude, don't say that. Like, that's not true. That's bad, whatever. that shows women that men are here with us, that it's not men versus women, it's men and women together versus sexism versus the patriarchy. And that has value. So I know Cord kind of called out performative feminism or performative allyship. To me, the stuff that's purely self-serving, that's just saying, hey, look how cool I am, or look how good and virtuous I am, that's not great. But if it's to show others, hey, I'm here for you, or hey, we should all be here for others, that is the good kind.
Agreed. And it also takes a load off of a marginalized person. Every time Matt or Brian hop into a thread where some sexist dude is being sexist, it alleviates work for women to advocate for themselves. And that is so appreciated. I mean, Matt and Brian, we love you. We stan you so hard. Every time I see you on Twitter, my heart sings. So thank you so, so much. We see you. We love you. We appreciate you.
I'm so grateful that Cord, Brian, and Matt were all willing to come and chat with us today. We've talked before about toxic masculinity in our culture, and a big part of that is the expectation that men are not allowed to show vulnerability. And I think talking about being an ally, talking about getting to that point where you're willing to speak up is showing a lot of vulnerability. And so just really, Cord, Matt, Brian, thank you.
Y'all are all dope. Thank you so much. And as always, we want to hear from y'all and your thoughts on this. So you can always email us at fairsense@gmail.com. It's always a little weird because when you say at,
and then at again.
Yeah, exactly. It's so silly, but we are fairsense@gmail.com. You can always find our show notes and leave a comment on our website, which is thefairsense.com.
And of course, you can find show notes in your podcast app too. And in them this week, we will have links to Cord's website, his Tumblr, his Twitter, his Medium page. He's got all kinds of good stuff going on. And to Matt and Brian's blogs and Twitter accounts. So you can follow along and watch them fighting the good fight and give them a high five for it. Please follow them. And if you love the show and you always make a point of listening, we'd be so grateful if you'd leave us a star review in iTunes. Just tap a number of stars. Simple as that. It takes 1 second. And if you feel like leaving a text review, lately Kara has actually not been proposing to people who've left reviews, but she has invited them to like slumber parties. So
yeah, at this point, I'm just like such a bigamist. I really feel like I need to rein it in. But slumber parties, making cookies together, whatever, definitely want to hang. Yes, you can always tweet at us at FairSense, and you can now find us on Instagram. So if you are more of a gram user, we are at FairSense there.
We're going to be back in a few weeks with part 2 of this discussion, continuing the topic of how to be a good ally, but talking about how white women can be better allies to women of color. So stay tuned for that. Stay tuned for talk next week of my book, because it's happening.
Woo! Dreams becoming reality. So stay tuned for my solo album, because that's coming out as well.
And it's really more like dreams becoming surreality, because it's all just very surreal. It's not real at this point. So we'll see if that changes in the next week, but I kind of doubt it.
It's very exciting. Wow, the next episode, you'll be a published author, which is hella rad. So, until then, stay rad.
Eek! Stay rad! The Fairer Sense are Kara Perez and me, Tanja Hester. Editing by me. Our theme song is by The Insider. All other music appears courtesy of the generous and mysterious Breakmaster Cylinder. If you need music to license for your podcast or other project, check them out at breakmastercylinder.bandcamp.com. You can always find me at ournextlife.com and Kara at bravelygo.co.
Love Cord. Wow, we got to cut so much of this out. I am just like singing this man's praises. Holy moly, I sound like a stalker.
You're giving me super good bloopers too.
Oh my god, okay. Let me pull myself back.